Welcome to Planet Poetry, the podcast for poets and poetry lovers. My name's Robin Houghton.
And I'm Peter Kenny. And in each episode we interview a poet and get them to share some of their work. And this episode we meet Ellen Cranitch and hear poems from her new collection, Crystal, published by Bloodaxe.
Now, because we're Planet Poetry, we like to keep an eye on the heavens, and there's been plenty of excitement up there lately. A parade of planets has inspired Peter to bring out some of his favourite starry poems, hasn't it, Peter?
It certainly has. Yes, heavenly, gorgeous poems, inspired from above.
Oh, looking forward to that.
Before all that twinkly stuff, let's hear what Ellen Cranitch had to say to Robin.
Ellen Cranitch was born in London of Irish parents. Her debut collection, The Immortalist, was shortlisted for the Seamus Heaney Award for Best First Collection. Her new collection, Crystal, was published in April 2024 by Bloodaxe and was chosen as Observer Poetry Book of the Month. Ellen has taught creative writing and literature at a number of universities including Hull, Bath Spa, University College London and City University of London. She currently works at the City Lit Institute in London, teaching the Masterclass and Advanced Poetry Workshop. Ellen Cranitch, welcome to Planet Poetry.
Thank you, Robin. It's really great to be here.
Your latest book, Crystal, is what we're going to be speaking about today. Now, I don't think I'm giving away any spoilers in saying that the book centres around the shock and the aftermath of discovering your partner was secretly a drug addict for many years.
Yes.
Is that safe to say?
That is safe to say, yes, that's exactly right. The book's inspired by real life. My partner's addiction in the past to crystal methamphetamine. And in the collection, I wanted to trace the journey of the partner of the addict because I find it's far less commonly represented.
Yes, yes.
And I wanted to trace the period just before knowing because it's very common for partners of addicts to not know and then to discover or have things revealed because addicts tend to be secretive to control their habit. So I wanted to start with the period of not knowing, then the revelations, and then the immediate aftermath.
Yes.
And I found there were a couple of things. I mean, it was quite a challenging book to write, and it came about after quite a long time after the experience.
Right.
But there were a couple of things that really helped me write it. And one was when the overarching conceit of the crystal as a kind of binding metaphor occurred to me and as a kind of governing principle. And then the second thing was satisfying myself as to the ethical issues that arise when you're writing about a living person close to you.
Yes.
And my husband, he's been in recovery now for many years, and he was 100% behind the publication, which mattered to me absolutely. So those were the big challenges of the book.
Well, we'll touch a bit on that later. That will come up again. I think maybe let's just, you talk about, you wanted to start with the not knowing period. And I like the way you lead the reader through this business of not knowing, and we're kind of dropped little kind of hints, kind of statements every now and again that makes you think, hang on a minute. So perhaps you could start with one of the poems from near the beginning, the prose poem Athens 2.
Sure. Athens 2. We're in a hotel room off the city centre. Outside, homeless dogs roam the forecourt of an unopened Costa. Tinsel swings, catching splinters of thin winter light. In the distance, raucous voices of dock workers celebrate loudly, following a victory for Olympiakos. Suddenly, he is a different person. He tries to prevent me calling my children, my brother. He says I am playing our sons off between us. He accuses me of being devious and says I am forcing him to have to control me. Where are they now, the words to hold me, to assuage?
Thank you. It's a starting point where before the revelations, so we know there's big stuff to come. And also there's this sense of, already you're touching on the idea of losing one's identity. Suddenly he's a different person. And this is something also that I think is true to say of the poet, of yourself as you're writing this. It's you're going through these changes and trying to hold on to your identity. Some of the poems are overtly about changing, aren't they? You've picked some stories from Ovid's Metamorphoses, including the story of Actaeon.
Yes, that's absolutely right. When you've been in a long-term relationship with somebody and they change in terms of personality, which is partly symptoms of addiction, you have to question yourself, the part of you that's grown in conjunction with them. So the loss of identity was very much a theme. But the reason I was also interested in the Metamorphoses is because many of the transformations entail loss of voice.
Ah, yes.
And with Actaeon, with all the transformations that Ovid depicts, physical state changes and the voice changes, but the consciousness, the mind, remains the same. So those moments have an acute sort of extremity of suffering to them because the protagonist knows that they have changed physical state. They know they can no longer speak, but they can't do anything about that. They are landed with that knowledge. So I found the story of Actaeon a very good one to use in the collection.
And it's a sonnet, the poem.
And it's a sonnet, exactly. Shall I read that one?
Yes, please do.
The story of Actaeon. Actaeon's a hunter who is out in the forest, and he comes across the goddess Diana, who is also a hunter. But she's bathing in a pool and she's naked, and he catches sight of her, and that, in her view, is an utter violation. So she curses him and changes him into a stag, who's then devoured by his own hounds. Actaeon. All that he knows he is, his sense of self, knelt. He lowers his life, his long-stemmed stag's limbs. Around him, the forest floor. Above, a mauve scent, chalk blue elderberries. He tries to reach, but can't. The dog's bloody teeth in his hide, on his neck, dragging it down. His tongue, useless, a root. The light in his eyes, fading now, a dumb plea. A last time he tries to lift up his head, and feels the airy scaffold, the pure braced weight of bone, the wonder of the branching concave crown. The entire antler edifice move as one, and like an open hand, a hunter's glove, flare out to catch and hold an instant the human voice that she had taken from him.
It's beautiful. Do tell us more.
I've always been interested in what the feeling from the inside of that physical change of state might be. And I found the sonnet form worked really well for exploring that because it turns on the moment of Actaeon's awareness that the crown of antlers is actually a part of himself. But then I wanted to develop the poem, and I imagined at the end that the antlers actually flare out to catch his voice that he's lost for a moment, so that in a series of poems about loss of voice, this one functions as a moment of hope, because what happens at the end is that suddenly, triumphantly, even if just for a short moment, his voice is restored.
Now, the way you tell the story, the sequencing of poems through the book is quite fractured. I mean, I like this a lot. There are these time shifts, there are breaks in the action, if you like, episodes that span groups of poems, musings on works of literature. It feels disorientating when one reads it, but presumably this was intentional. Perhaps you can talk a bit more about that.
Yes, definitely it was. I mean, I had two sort of narrative aims, if you like, in writing the collection. One was to trace through the partner's journey in this very sort of specific period. And the second was to kind of testify to the things that I found were there to sustain me through it all. But I really wanted a non-linear, non-chronological structure and to move back and forth in time. And I think that's because poetry is allusive and it works by sort of juxtaposition and symbol and suggestion. I sort of thought poems refract experience often to arrive at understanding. And the governing conceit of this is the crystal, whose planes refract light. So it just felt completely right that there should be a method of refraction of my experience through a lot of different lenses. It just felt that that's what intrinsically that's how the collection should operate. But I think you're right as well in suggesting perhaps that it's how the mind works as well. When you go back and memory works, things are not linear, they are not sequential. You know?
And things are different when you revisit them often, or you're in this situation. I imagine there was an awful lot of trying to decode things that had happened in the past or things that had occurred to you in the past and reframing them, as it were, as it developed.
That's exactly right, because in fact, because you discover after the person has been an active addict for some time, you revisit occasions in the past and you suddenly realise that was going on then. So that's absolutely right, yes.
And you mentioned when we began that you had your partner's blessing on this whole project. Also taking quite a big part in the book are your sons, aren't they? Tom and Dan. Their lives, their coming and goings, memories of things. I like the way that sometimes they appear in a poem, but they're not exactly passive, but they're also not active. They're referred to, but they're just there, like a presence, like a comforting presence, I suppose, and kind of a foil, your relationship with them, to this dysfunctional marital relationship, I guess. Tell us a bit more about how you wanted them to function, and presumably they are also entirely on board with this whole project.
Yes, I mean, it was interesting with their inclusion. They were both really behind it. And when I said, do you want me to change your names? I can change your names. They said, no, I want my name. I want my name. But I think, the source of it is that when you feel like your identity and your relationship with your partner is kind of dissolving all over the place, your children become incredibly important, just that act of connection, which their presence asserts. But I liked the idea of including their lives to a certain extent because it allowed me to structure sort of little mini narrative arcs within the collection, which hopefully would enrich it. And like you say, bring a different kind of tonal quality, sort of a breath of fresh air, because they're at a different stage of their lives and all that kind of thing.
Yes.
But also it was important because it allowed me to articulate a very different but very powerful notion of love. And love is actually a very fundamental theme of the collection. Its capaciousness and variety and the fact that it endures. So it allowed me to do that as well.
Yes. Well, perhaps we might hear one of the Tom and Dan poems. I've got them in my mind, which is The Drive West.
The Drive West. A volatile sun. The yellow of the earth's rim turning to deep orange. I am driving with Dan into the last light, trying to get to Bristol before dark, and the red disk begins rapidly to sink, drawing to a close a late September day, and giving a last illumination to the landscape. The lush oaks near Marlborough, the dip I'd normally view in daylight, now at dusk, tantalizingly strange, with the crosshatch of street and house lights. Last night, just to see him again after all he had revealed, elicited such intense anger and hurt. Today, it has taken hours to get out of London. But the healing of the long drive west, the drive itself was purpose. We were primed at the promising horizon, shedding. The beauty of the dusk accompanying the ending of a part of life, but the skyline extending, offering more. Dan silent beside me, looking at the fire sky, at the world opening out, as we drove towards the rite of passage of his final year.
There's so many gorgeous details, and I love, the the lush oaks near Marlborough and the skyline and the sunset. And then there's this idea of the world opening out. It feels very hopeful and positive, as if after this terrible confrontation in London, you're escaping it. And it feels like nature is stepping in to offer some kind of solace. And nature does play that role through the book, I think, doesn't it?
That's exactly what I wanted and felt and experienced. And I'm so glad you picked up on that, the idea of nature stepping in, because I experienced throughout things coming to me, as it were, unbidden. I mean, and nature, certainly the sunset in this particular one, seemed to arrive at me. And it's interesting because it feels almost like the opposite of T.S. Eliot's objective correlative, where the poet reaches to the landscape and plucks out symbols and then employs them in a poem. I didn't feel it was like that at all. I felt I was actually, these things were coming to me, almost like an act of grace. And that was a very interesting aspect of the whole experience.
Really? Yeah. And later on, I think we see these colours, the colours of nature. And I suppose that, again, we're thinking of how crystals refract colours, and particularly the colour blue seems quite dominant. And of course, colours are something that you start the collection with. There are 2 or 3 poems, I think, about the painter Bonnard.
Yeah, I find colour really does allow us to express emotion. Somehow it feels like emotion almost inheres in different colours. And I think blue, it's true, that does become a kind of central colour for me. I've always been interested in the way that for specific poets, a specific colour can seem to run through their collections and represent so many different things. So I noticed in John Burnside's work, it's white. And in someone like Natalie Diaz, it's green. And the more you read their work, the more that colour recurs and you begin to see what it means for them. It means so many things. And I think for me, in some ways, blue and all its variants like turquoise and things did seem to be the one that could most express the sort of gamut of emotions. It's very interesting.
Yes, absolutely. And something else that seems to be a theme is the power of literature and of poetry to offer consolation. You say quite overtly in a number of places that this was something that helped see you through. And it was mentioned in the very first poem you read, Athens 2, at the end, the last line, "Where are they now, the words to hold me?" So is that another thing that you turned to?
Definitely. I mean, I really believe that poetry is there to sustain us, not in any kind of limp or consoling way, but through its strength, through the force and charge of its language and its imagery and its thought. I mean, I think what happens when we read poetry when we're in times of extremis is that we initially make a connection. And that connection is sometimes based on the fact that someone else, often from a very different period, has thought and felt things similar to us. But then, of course, it's a poem. It's an artifact in language. It's transformed through all the resources of poetry, music and imagery into something beautiful. And then often it goes further than being transformed. It actually transcends the experience. So it takes us through. So I just think poetry is so powerful in these moments.
Something you tackle very honestly, I think, are the reactions of other people, how they judged the situation, how people felt you should be tackling it and who's to blame. We feel the pain of the poet trying to understand her own responses and not be judgmental in the way that others clearly are. I found that really interesting, how you circled around that and tried to sort of work it out almost. And there are a pair of poems that perhaps you could read both together, because I think that illustrates the point quite well, which is reactions followed by kinship.
Reactions. You should fight to save your marriage. Translation. A failed marriage is shameful. Will you take him back? Translation. A relationship is something that can be given and withdrawn. Surely you knew. Translation. I am a liar. I am lying to this friend and to myself. Don't you think you were naive? Translation. No man can be trusted. Why couldn't you see that? You're in denial. Translation. I am refusing to confront what's going on. You should have an affair. Translation: an affair is the appropriate, vengeful act. Kinship. It's not that I don't tell people what I'm going through, it's that I have learned to be wary. Some people I think of as close express a pity that lacks empathy. Others hover on the threshold of prurient curiosity. And yet, the electrifying spark, like a twist of copper wire gleaming, of a true friend. The vertiginous deepening of our relationship. The immeasurable gratitude I feel to those who meet me with compassion, who attempt understanding.
These two poems, they feel like a pair, although they're part of a little group, I think. But when I read them, the one after the other, it felt almost like a haibun, whereas, although I know Reactions is not a haiku, but this idea of a very spare poem, short lines, and then a kind of almost a commentary, a working through, is what Kinship feels like. Is that how you intended it? Because I feel that there are places in the book where there is kind of commentary.
Yeah, it's very interesting because although I was saying, I wasn't interested in a sequential thing, when I was putting the poems together, there were ways in which one seemed to comment on each other and seemed therefore to be good. And I think what you say about the haibun is very interesting. It does feel to me, although I hadn't thought about it consciously, but it does feel to me that it operates like that.
Not only are there quite a few prose poems that seem to often fulfill that role, but you've also got these brief textbook definitions or academic explanations that kind of are dotted throughout. They're in a different font, so it's clearly that they are separate. They're not poems of any description. I rather liked it as a device. It sort of reminded me of a Greek chorus stepping in and also a bit of an educational intervention, like just educating the reader so that we've got the facts, if you like, or whatever the science is. Was the idea also to suggest how the poet approaches a problem from a rational viewpoint, stepping back and trying to understand?
Yes, I think it does all those things. I think that it definitely sort of mirrors the partner's growing understanding of addiction, which is a very complicated thing. But I also got interested in including those more objective stanzas, those pages where the addiction specialists comment, for creative reasons, because I'm quite interested in signification. And sometimes I found that including a bit, like there's a bit of dialogue between an interviewer and the addiction specialist, Dr. Gabor Mate, that sometimes those things would acquire a quality of the poetic. So there's, just through being in that context, there's a moment when a tiny bit of dialogue where the interviewer says, "Is the addict's aim to get the most pleasure as possible in as short a time as possible?" And Dr. Gabor Mate says, "Not to get the most pleasure, but to get the most relief from pain." And I found that sort of exchange, very brief exchange, had a lot of the qualities, the balance, the antithesis, very distilled of poetry. So when you put it into this collection, it can communicate in lots of different ways. And that interested me as well.
It was certainly interesting as a reader. I enjoyed those little asides. And as you say, that one, I do remember that one. And I was thinking about that for a while before I moved on. Now, you mentioned how love is a particularly important theme. Towards the end of the book, we do get the impression that the relationship does actually survive. But even that, I had to keep thinking, is it going to survive? And there was this really interesting poem called Grey, which has this connotation of a grey area. And I felt that was quite significant. And when you reveal that you had never told him that the relationship was over, and he says that was one of the things that gave him hope. And that the fact that this poem is called Grey, you're still left thinking, but was it over? We're still not sure. And also grey, it's almost the opposite of colour. We've had these colours that have kind of glowed, jewel-like, crystal-like throughout the book. And so I found that was very intriguing at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a key poem for me. It was partly about how in a relationship you can bounce each other into more dogmatic positions. It was about trying to hold on to, if you like, the not knowing, the kind of, it's very difficult to stay in a space, but to be more nuanced. it's difficult, but it allows for so much more potential. But it's interesting what you say, because it strikes me for the first time that it's the not saying, it's the silence that's eloquent in that moment.
Yes. But it's a much better healing silence than there's a very early poem where you're kind of staring at each other and trying to second guess each other, and there's this kind of bubbling under frustration and anger. So it's almost, you could tell you've really come through that to a different and a better place, I guess.
Yes.
So I'd like to finish on a really positive note. There's a lovely, the very last poem in the book, but from what you've been saying, I suspect this particular incident that it portrays was not at the end of all of this, but possibly before all of this.
Yes.
And it's the final poem is Minerals Gallery, Natural History Museum, London. Do you want to introduce that and read that one for us?
Yes. So you're absolutely right. This poem, although it ends the book, it was what was actually the starting point of the whole collection. So when these events happened, and my husband was severely addicted, I didn't think of writing poetry about that at all. I wrote some things to try and understand what was going on, but I never thought of bringing that into poetry. And many years, some years later anyway, I was in the Minerals Gallery in the Natural History Museum, and I was looking at crystals and their properties. And I happened to be reading a book of poetry by the Spanish mystic poets, John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. And Teresa of Avila has this idea of the crystal castle, which is the place the soul resides. And I thought the crystal castle where the soul resides and the Minerals Gallery, I suddenly thought I could write a collection bound by the motif of the crystal. And it would be refracting and sort of self-generating, and it would give lots of ideas. And I did find that to be the case. But only then did I think I could bring in crystal meth. And then I had to satisfy myself that the three living people reference would be 100% behind it in order to move forward.
How did you even broach that to them?
I was writing for quite a while without showing it. And then I didn't know whether it would come into the form of a collection, and then I think my sons read it and they were very clearly behind it. And I think my husband was surprisingly very clearly behind it. And I think the reason was that we both have always felt united against the stigma around addiction.
Yes,
also,
yes.
It's a long time ago. So years have intervened. And also, he is a member of Narcotics Anonymous very actively, and he talks about his experience all the time. So the book doesn't function to reveal anything that he's not already owning and talking about. So in fact, I found they were all much more ready. I was the one with the greatest reservations, because I think the ethics of, about writing about living people has always exercised me a lot.
Yes.
But I find at the moment also that it's funny how it functions in terms of my sons. Their poems are things where they feel very happy to have that there in the world, sort of thing.
Which is wonderful, isn't it? It's wonderful. They want to be part of your testimony, that they are a part of it and they were there.
Yeah. So I'll read the last poem then. Minerals Gallery, Natural History Museum, London. As a child, I would come to this dark, vaulted space to escape the heat of the city. I'd rest my forehead on the display case's cool brass frame and peer through the glass at the shimmering prisms. It wasn't just the rarity of the names that captivated me, peridot, beryl, carnelian, nor where those names came from, opal, Sanskrit for precious stone, zircon, Farsi for golden, which swept me away to distant times and places. It wasn't even for the intensity of the colours, though was there ever a blue like azurite, and what is colour anyway but spheres of silica splitting the light? It wasn't just to marvel at the 19th century collectors who showed me the wealth under my own soil, gold nuggets from Wicklow, crystals, leaf green from Cornwall, grey from the Mendip Hills. It wasn't even for the thrill of the different expressions of the crystalline forms, One of my favourites, a spray of ice-white splinters like needles of glass. No, it was something to do with looking into the heart of earth and deep into time, at a mystery that held within it the promise of a pattern. And it was for that one special crystal, a milky quartz, and within that a purple lustre, what is known as the ghost amethyst. I look at it now again, and it is for me a pledge. It urges me to wait, like the crystal that lies in darkness waits, until the earth's crust cracks, and the sun spills into its blind underworld, releasing a torrent of brilliance and colour. It is the conviction that something as yet opaque, unformed, such as perhaps this experience, can contain within itself a kind of beauty, and that beauty, like love, is transformative.
Lovely, thank you. I must admit, I got to the end of this book and I was full of admiration for how you coped with all this. I mean, there must have been an awful lot of people who couldn't have seen their way through such a scenario, such an incredible scenario. And I like some of the lines here, actually. At a mystery that held within it the promise of a pattern. That's almost like describing a poem or a poetry collection. You know, you start off not knowing what you're getting into, both as the reader and as the writer, I think, and something reveals itself, and that can be the beauty of poetry.
Absolutely.
I think it's a wonderful collection, and thank you for sharing all of that with us. But I do want to ask you if there's anything you are working on at the moment, or are you having a little break? Are you doing something completely different? Feel free to share anything you wish to.
Yes, well, I am writing another collection of poetry which has got nothing to do with addiction.
Okay.
Hooray. Because these events happened some time ago.
Yes.
But I'm also working on an imminent performance because I have a cousin in Ireland who has the same name as me, Ellen Cranitch. I think we are the only two. But she's a musician. So she's a composer, a musician, and she's a radio presenter for Lyric FM.
Ah.
And she is going to compose music, especially inspired by the poems in Crystal, and I'm going to read them. So we're going to collaborate and take this round Ireland in the summer. But we're trying to work out what to call ourselves because we're both Ellen Cranitch.
The two Ellens. Ellen Cranitch squared.
Exactly. I think squared would work. I think that would work really well.
Gosh, well, that sounds really interesting. A good collaboration. And how funny. Yeah. A cousin with exactly the same name.
Yeah, and we're the only two.
Well, that sounds great fun and something new, but that follows quite well on from this. Thank you, Ellen, so much for coming on and reading from Crystal, published by Blood Axe.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to talk.
That was such an interesting conversation with Ellen Cranitch. One of the things that struck me immediately was this kind of overarching crystal metaphor. The way she talked about things was so amazingly clear, and she had such a kind of sharp, clear view of what she wanted her collection to be, and this idea of not kind of stringing it all together in a narrative, but letting each sort of facet of the crystal sort of gleam out in its own way.
Yeah, it was perfect, wasn't it?
Yeah. I can just imagine, going to the Geological Museum, perhaps with children or whatever running about, and you'll suddenly get hypnotised by these crystals.
What a moment. And then more connections keep coming. But yeah.
Just all the beautiful words for all the crystals. You've just got a whole kind of vocabulary of loveliness there. Peridot, beryl, carnelian, zircon, azurite, all these lovely words that you can just sprinkle into the poem to make it spring and seem unusual. Just lovely. But I like, she was flirting with Greece in this, wasn't she? Somewhere in the book she's talking about Cavafy.
Yes.
And this idea of Ovid as well, the metamorphosis and the changing I found it interesting how she picked out on this loss of voice in the poem Action. He gets changed into a stag, but he loses his voice, and the whole poem with a kind of really unusual turn in a way, with that the stag's tines, like a hand trying to grasp this last trace of his own voice.
Yes, really unusual, really mysterious. You see so many depictions in art, don't you, of that story?
Yeah.
And I only really thought about it in a visual way, but when she said about the loss of voice, it was very striking how she treated it.
Yeah, something about the way she uses colour in that poem. Above a mauve scent, chalk blue elderberries. I don't know, something about that, just those words. Sometimes I get very triggered by colour words, and I think those chalk blue elderberries just gave me a little non-specific thrill.
Yeah.
I thought that was an extremely accomplished poem. I really enjoyed that one.
How did you find the idea of telling this story? We get one or two tiny glimpses of what went on between them in terms of conversation or not, in fact. Sometimes it's depicting the silence. But he's very much on the sidelines. It's very much her trying to work it through, her and her sons, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, she was talking about she had two sort of ambitions about tracing through her partner's journey and also the second one was testifying to the things that sustained her. This collection isn't a kind of misery memoir. There's lots of flashes of beauty, isn't there? And
certainly beauty and love and, her relationship with her sons clearly was a huge part of helping her get through this. And also we talked about her love of literature and how important that was. I really liked this device of dividing up the action, if you like, with little factual interludes. I didn't ask Ellen to read any of those, but they're kind of little textbook descriptions. There's a page entitled Theories of Addiction. So we've got a little paragraph from the Journal of the Academy of Social Sciences, and we've got a specialist commenting. And it does break up the tension as well for the reader, I think. We want to know what happens next, even though it's not a sequential story.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah. For example, there's a dictionary definition. Definition of enabling from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. One who enables another to achieve an end, especially one who enables another to persist in self-destructive behaviour, such as substance abuse, by providing excuses or by making it possible to avoid the consequences of such behaviour.
Wow, yeah.
That made me think, gosh, you've got to be harsh. You've got to kind of not
be an enabler.
No, and you might think, I'm not enabling, and yet I could see how some actions or behaviours actually might be seen that way.
She talked about these little snippets kind of acquiring the quality of the poetic in a way. I like that sort of idea of these little fragments of a different way of speaking, somehow smelling slightly of poetry by the juxtaposition with poems.
That's just an example. We've got some dictionary definitions and we've got quotes from experts in their field. Yes, and we've got a whole page on this chemical, this drug, crystal methamphetamine, chemical number C10H15N. And then we've got a whole list of appearance, slang names, symptoms of addiction. So quite early on, and that's from an addiction specialist, we're kind of educated almost, so that we've got the back, the kind of thing that if you were going through this, you would want to know straight away. You want to know everything about it, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Well, you were sort of suggesting that she was kind of trying to be as rational as possible, trying to understand the nuts and bolts of, addiction.
Yeah. As a counterbalance to the dreadful emotional upheaval the whole experience must have given.
That poem of hers about the reactions, I quite enjoyed that idea of reading the sort of subtext to people's unthinking utterances.
Yes, absolutely.
You should fight to save your marriage. Translation, a failed marriage is shameful.
Yeah. I suppose these reactions from people who are, her friends.
Yeah.
I mean, or one doesn't know exactly who these people who said these things are, but it's just a knee-jerk reaction, isn't it, if you hear something like that, because you immediately think, surely that couldn't happen to me. That would, my partner, that would never happen. And so it's just a kind of a protective reaction. And
It is, yeah.
I like the way she worked through that one and then went on to go into kinship, which was that sort of Heiban-like thinking it through.
I have a confession that I didn't really know about Heibuns until about a year or so ago.
Oh,
But I think it worked very well as a Heibun type relationship. The second one, the kinship, which is printed as a prose poem. Some beautiful lines, and yet the electrifying spark, like a twist of copper wire gleaming of a true friend. And I sort of quite like that drive west as well, driving away from an awful scene and gradually, she was talking about your opposite of an objective correlative. You're not seeking things from the world to represent, what you're thinking, but they sort of thrust themselves on you, and you find that they actually influence the way you write the poem.
Yeah, that was lovely. Yes, there's a good variety of form in this book as well. I didn't bang on about form like I sometimes do, but we've got some very accomplished villanelle, sonnets, and prose poems.
I don't know. From what I've seen, I just think this works extremely well, this collection. And I really liked her writing so much. And
another banger from Blood Axe.
Yeah, banger after banger.
The other evening, at around sunset, we were making our way in a car from Beachy Head and noticed a field full of people all staring at the sunsets. And I just thought, what's going on? Some kind of a bit of druidry or something. And I had heard that there's something going on in the night sky in the last week or so. So, Peter, perhaps you'd like to mansplain to me exactly what that was all about.
Yes,
thank you.
Actually, that was a parade of planets, Robin.
Oh.
Which means that planets all align, so you can sort of draw an imaginary line between them all. Yeah, it was 7 of them, so it's Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Was it Uranus as well? Neptune, but most of the planets anyway, and the bright ones. Yeah, because I was walking along by the sea probably the same day and looking up at the sky and thinking, this is when it's all supposed to happen, but I did it too early, so all I got was a gorgeous sunset. And I could see Venus, incredibly bright and beautiful. As soon as I saw Venus, I started thinking about how to think like a poet with
Di George.
With Di George, and he had a sort of section on John Donne.
Yes.
Donne's got this poem, His Parting from Her, it's called. It starts with this beautiful kind of astronomical kind of metaphysical image. He says, "Since she must go and I must mourn, come night, environ me with darkness whilst I write. Shadow that hell unto me, which alone I am to suffer when my love is gone. Alas, the darkest magic cannot do it. Thou and great hell to boot are shadows to it. Should Cynthia quit thee, Venus, and each star, it would not form one thought dark as mine are."
Well,
and
how lovely.
But in that,
and hell to boot.
But that thing about, should Cynthia quit thee, Venus, and Cynthia is another word for the moon. So it's
okay.
Should Cynthia quit thee, Venus, and each star, it would not form one thought dark as mine are. I just think that's so wonderfully kind of that thing about, when you're young and in love and just, things aren't going right. It's literally the end of the world, and you may as well rope in all this kind of starry imagery as well to make it seem even more immense.
Yes.
But I wonder why do us poets love stars so much?
Yes.
Because there's so much star imagery in poetry, isn't there?
There is. Well, we are conflating stars and planets here, I suppose, aren't we? Of course, we know the difference.
Yeah. Celestial imagery,
Celestial
yes.
bodies or whatever. Yes. I don't know about you, but it's just, for me, it's the one thing you look at and they're always there, they're always the same. And you just think, gosh, people have been looking up at these exact same constellations or planets for forever, before the dinosaurs, or even when the Earth was like not even a thing. And that just blows my mind. And so there's something about the steadfastness, isn't there, of the night sky and the brightness of stars, and the way we use the word star in a metaphorical way all the time, don't we? So there's just something mysterious, unknowable, and yet intensely familiar about them, and that for me is just ridiculous. And how do you even get your head around the idea of, we see the planets, you said about Venus, and it looks enormous there, and you think, wow, and then there's another star next to it, and it's a bit dingy and a bit, not very big. And not only is it like 50 billion times further away, it's going to be 50 billion times bigger than little Venus, I expect. But we can't get our heads around that, can we? What, I would explode if I tried to really think about that.
I think I like the idea of people looking at the stars and kind of mapped patterns and constellations, and also with astrology, obviously not anything to do with astronomy, but
it used to be, though.
Yeah. Well, with that idea that our fates and our lives are somehow woven in the patterns of planets and stars and so on.
Yeah.
We've always historically ascribed lots of meanings to what's going on overhead. And I think that one of the sadness of 21st century or 20th century life is that not being able to see the stars so much. I remember as a child in Guernsey, that all the street lights went off at 10:30 or something.
Gosh, really?
Yeah.
That must have been amazing.
That's what my grandfather did every night. Stand outside in the back garden and just look at stars.
Really?
That's part of his sort of daily ritual. Yeah, it's really nice.
They didn't used to turn the lights off in Lewisham or Catford when I was a kid. To go to a place where you really can see the stars, that must be amazing.
Well, one of the places I have done that in more recent years is Greece. I love going to Greece on holiday. I remember one night particularly, after a few ouzos, I just was staying on a place and just lay on my back on the roof, just kind of looking up at the stars, and it was just absolutely awesome.
Wow.
Which segues into my perpetual obsession with Greek poets. And Odysseus Elytis, he was born in 1911, and he won the Nobel Prize. I think it was 1971, something like that, mainly for this profound collection called the Axion Esti, which deals with war experiences in Greece and humanity in a kind of autobiography. It's an amazing book. I mean, he's an amazing poet. But there's one of his short poems called I No Longer Know the Night, and it talks about Hesperus in this, which is yet another word for Venus, or the evening star.
Oh, is it? I didn't know
Hesperus was the son of Aphrodite, god of the evening star. This is a fairly early poem, and he started off by being quite taken with surrealism as a way of kind of wriggling out of some of the heaviness of that legacy of Greek culture. But he's still intensely Greek. Anyway, I'll just read the poem. I no longer know the night, death's terrible anonymity. A fleet of stars has dropped anchor in the depths of my soul. Hesperus, sentinel, so that you may shine close to the heavenly breeze of an island that dreams of me, announcing the dawn from its high crags. My two eyes enfolding you steer you by the star of my true heart. I no longer know the night. I no longer know the names of the world that denies me. With clarity I read the shells, the leaves, the stars. Vain is my antagonism on the sky's high roads, unless it is the dream that gazes at me again, with tears as I cross the sea of deathlessness. Hesperus, beneath the arc of your golden fire, the night that is only night, I now no longer know. I think it was in a collection published during the Second World War. He's looking out at these stars and, a fleet of stars has dropped anchor in the depths of my soul.
Yeah.
Suddenly he's surrounded by darkness, and he gets absorbed by the light of the stars, and it gives him a way free and kind of elevates him and takes him out of his circumstances. I think it's a beautiful poem. And that was Edmund Keeley and Philip Sherard translated that poem. Yeah, there's 2 books you should read by Odysseus Elytis. The Selected Poems. Who published that? That was Anvil some time ago, so this is an old copy. And the Actionesti as well. It's absolutely fantastic.
No, lovely. Thank you for that.
And now also, because I've decided just to read some of my favourite poems, the last one. This is William Butler Yeats.
I love a bit of WB.
When you are old and grey and full of sleep and nodding by the fire, take down this book and slowly read and dream of the soft look your eyes had once and of their shadows deep. How many loved your moments of glad grace and loved your beauty with love false or true, but one man loved the pilgrim soul in you and loved the sorrows of your changing face, and bending down beside the glowing bars, murmur a little sadly how love fled and paced upon the mountains overhead and hid his face amid a crowd of stars. That's just gorgeous, isn't it, that?
Lovely. And ending on the word stars.
And it's all about Maud Gunn, this woman that he had, kind of idealised and had an obsessive attraction to, although they were mates.
Yeah.
She friend-zoned him almost immediately, which was terrible.
Oh, dear. Oh.
And he's picturing her as an old woman and, suddenly thinking, oh gosh, that guy that my friend-zoned was really the one that really got me.
Of course.
So it's kind of very passive-aggressive in a way.
Yes.
Typical Yeats. But yeah. So anyway, I'm done with stars now.
I think that's all been absolutely delightful, all the star and planetary talk. I think something not totally unrelated that's been filling my mind in the last few days has been the fact that we've had these bright blue skies and spring is coming, surely, with all this sunlight that's streaming in. Even though it's still very cold. Yes. There is something lovely, isn't there, about the first sunny days of the year. And it's really unusual, I think, for early March to have a whole week of blue skies. We've been very lucky perhaps it's just our part of the country, I don't know. So I actually looked at a poem by the lovely Thomas Tranströmer.
Oh, he's fantastic. Yeah.
So this is a little poem called The Light Streams In. Outside the window, the long beast of spring, the transparent dragon of sunlight, rushes past like an endless suburban train. We never got a glimpse of its head. The shoreline villas shuffle sideways. They are proud as crabs. The sun makes the statues blink. The raging sea of fire out in space is transformed to a caress. The countdown has begun.
Oh, isn't that just fabulous?
Just beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
The light streams
He's so... I love his poetry. God, that's so great, isn't it?
That was from his collection, The Sad Gondola. I love that title. The Sad Gondola, 1996, translated by Robin Fulton. So, yeah, the sun and the stars, we are so lucky to be alive right now.
Yeah, it's spring. It's coming.
There are things to be thankful for.
Optimistic, yeah.
Exactly. We must not forget.